everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a question that got asked the other day on my Patreon, but I decided this is a sort of topic we should probably cover here on the main channel. I tend to answer people's personal individual questions there, but I realize again this is probably good for a bigger audience. Someone wanted to know, do I think it's better to do supinated, which is like this, or pronated chin-ups and rows? Particularly they wanted to know about rows. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. There's a couple different directions we can go with this, but what I want to talk about here is overall muscle balance. Because what I've told you guys before, you have 6 basic movement patterns that you probably need to be doing, right? If you want overall muscle balance. And they're all compound type movements. And I'm of the opinion that you should never use an isolation movement to do something that you can do with a compound. Now, that also includes, can you do it within your recovery ability? I understand that there's a threshold that we could argue about to where you can only handle so many big compound movements. And in some cases, you might need to isolate a muscle in order to get additional workload that you can still recover from. So a point of contention there. And, I will say there's a degree of truth to that. But as a general rule, if you can get the majority of your development from compounds, that is the most efficient and effective use of your time. So when it comes to things like functions of the arm, just like I talked about the other day, out of those 6 movements, there's a horizontal press and a vertical press. That vertical pressing tends to get the long head of the tricep more. That tends to get neglected for horizontal pressing, like a bench press or a closed grip bench press. So overhead pressing does tend to work more of the long head, which doesn't get worked there as much. Well, there's some things to consider with the other side of the arm when it comes to pulling, whether we're talking about rows or chin-ups. So what is it that I say? That you probably need to get really strong at least one exercise out of each of the 6 basic movement patterns. Well, that would include horizontal pulling and vertical pulling. Right? Everyone following so far? So that being said, if your goal was overall arm development, there is slightly different amounts of development involved with bicep and brachialis ratios and things like the brachioradialis, and all of that depending on if you grip overhand versus underhand. So it would be reasonable if your goal was to make sure that you try to get all those little weak points in your musculature using compounds, that maybe one of your pulls should be overhand and the other should be underhand. Again, just throwing it out there if your goal is overall muscle balance. And everyone should be seeking a reasonable amount of muscle balance, not just bodybuilders, not just physique-oriented people. Athletes. People who just don't want weaknesses in their body anywhere. People who are training for general fitness, people who are training for sports. You don't want to have weak links in your musculature. That's not ideal. That's not best for injury prevention. That's not best for overall performance. So it would make sense to do that. Now, my recommendations there are going to be that you really need an exercise that's going to put more stretch for your underhand versions. So I lean in the direction of using the chin-up for that, because we know that chin-ups have a greater effective range of motion than pull-ups do with an overhand grip. They have a fuller effective range of motion, and many people are slightly stronger on them because of the additional bicep involvement, but still getting the exact same amount of lat involvement. So for the most part, the chin-up is a slightly superior exercise to the overhand pull-up for overall muscle development. Also, we get to that point of getting that stretch on it. Chin-ups, you are capable of stretching the bicep. That carries over to injury prevention on things like deadlifts. So getting really good at a chin-up to where you stretch all the way down and get a good stretch on the bicep can reduce your chances of being hurt on a deadlift. It is one of the many tools that are there to help prevent bicep tears. So it becomes useful there. And so I would tend to recommend the overhand grip on the rows. Now, the exception to this might be a person who doesn't want to do chin-ups. So they're not doing pull-ups right now in your training cycle. And they don't want to do a bunch of curls either. So in that case, it makes sense on something like a pen lay row to use an underhand grip. Now, what I don't recommend there is what you see a lot of guys do. How many guys do we see in the gym who are now doing these underhand grip rows with a really lightweight, building no strength base, who are just doing a partial? They're not getting the stretch at the bottom. Well, if you're not getting the stretch at the bottom, it really, in my opinion, defeats the entire purpose of using a supinated grip. It defeats it completely because you want to get that stretch in the bicep. Otherwise, just go ahead and stick to the overhand grip because you're not really working the bicep that effectively anyways. And we see guys do it all the time. I see it every day in gyms. Guys who are overdoing these really high, at least 45 degrees off the floor, not stretching at the bottom, sometimes with 95 pounds, maybe 135. You don't ever see anyone doing them with a heavy weight other than maybe on YouTube. And so they come in and they play around with that. Then they need to go do a ton of curls to get any bicep development. And then, of course, they have no back development. So what I'm going to recommend, if you're going to do the row for that, you need to stick with something that gives you a deep stretch at the bottom. You need to have something that gets that full range of motion so that you get a stretch on the bicep if you're going to do that. And then you could move over to like maybe a power clean for your overhand grip. Now, a lot of people will say, well, properly done power clean doesn't have that much arm pull. And that's true, other than the weights that you tend to eventually be using with the speed you're moving the bar. You're still going to get significant recruitment in the arms, even if they're not really a primary mover, and they really aren't if it's executed correctly. But you're still going to get some motion in there. And in some cases, a person may not, in that given block of their training, they might not have room for a power clean, a row, and a weighted chin-up in terms of recovery and training volume, in which case it makes sense that they might want to go to an underhand grip for a pen lay row, as an example. Again, they get a full range of motion. And then they do the overhand grip for their power clean, because a power clean, it's not optional. That's the way you're going to do it. So it ultimately comes down to what you're trying to do with your training. But the take home here is that what I generally recommend is, again, just due to efficiency of the exercises, that you should probably do your chin-ups underhand grip and do your rows with an overhand grip just to get that proper balance. But obviously, as I said, there are exceptions to where in your training it might make sense. Of course, then you get other guys who are just so genetically gifted in their arms that it probably doesn't matter. They could just do both the same. But for the majority of us who are not, guys like me, I'm not genetically gifted in my arm development. I do not grow biceps particularly easily. I don't grow arms particularly easily, partially due to me having really long arms, not the best insertions, and so they just don't ever look that big, even compared to how they measure. There have been times where my arms measured 19 inches and the average person would think they were 16. It's just, I'm not built to look that way, and it's due to different leverages. So for guys like me, we really need to pay attention to stuff like that. It starts to become important for at least looks, if you care at all about that. It's going to matter. So that's kind of the whole point here, though, is that if you're wanting to not have to do a lot of isolation movements, you should put a little bit of thought into the way that you perform your compounds, because something like just using certain variations of compounds out of your basic movements that you're learning can fill in the gaps tremendously that you might normally use an isolation movement to do. And you know what? At the end of the day, even if you still choose to do some isolation movements, if you're mixing your big lifts in such a way to give better balance as far as these functions within smaller muscles like your arms, you're probably going to be able to get away with less isolation movements, or at the very least, you're still going to maximize total growth because you've already addressed the weak points to some extent with compounds before you move on to the isolation movements. And that's never a bad thing. It's never a bad thing to have just enough exercise variation and to put thought into your variation on your big compounds to achieve the muscle balance that you want. Again, just a little bit of forethought on it. But that's my general recommendations. And like I said, there could be cases where your training doesn't allow for it to work and you might want to do an underhand grip for like a pen lay row or any sort of row where you can get a full range of motion and do that. But then again, there are also some coaches out there who recommend the opposite. They recommend doing all rowing and chinning and all lat exercises with an underhand grip. At least some coaches out there who maybe have a strength conditioning background, who work with bodybuilders specifically, I have noticed that trend. And I've seen even people like Charles Poliquin, for example, mention that in the past. That what he does with a lot of times with bodybuilders, you have lagging arm development, that biceps are a weak point. He'll have them do that, get really strong on underhand grip pulling in general, and some hammer curls or whatever, just to address the brachialis and all that. So that's certainly another approach. But again, I think for overall development, I think most people would do better to do an overhand grip with one and an underhand grip with the other. And then you're going to need less total exercise variations in general to address different weaknesses. Because all of us need to be doing the 6 basic movement patterns anyways. So if we're all going to do a squat, we're all going to do a hip hinge, a vertical press, a horizontal press, a vertical pull, and a horizontal pull, picking just enough variation in those exercises to address potential imbalances can save you a whole lot of trouble down the road. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.